let's start today by sharing the answers to yesterday's assignment. I want to spend a little more time focusing on checking your work. This way you know whether you're getting the right answers. Please feel free to bring questions to class if you need clarification for any of them. Now, we spent a good amount of time in our last session talking about the properties of multiplication. And we found out that there were two basic rules. When the signs are the same, you just multiply and you get a positive product. And when the signs are different from two factors, then you get a negative product. We took it one step further when we discovered that if we had multiple factors, more than two, that we could count up the number of negative factors in that problem, and that would help us to determine if the final result would be a positive or negative product. We're going to now put variables into the mix, and we're going to look at using some of those same rules. I see that I have two of the same sign, and the same sign says that I'm going to have a positive product. In my next one, again, I have 3 times negative n times n times n. There's only one negative factor. 1 is an odd number. It's going to give me a negative 3n to the third. So again, when I'm multiplying, remember that you add your powers. That's how I got n to the third. All right, in my next one, let's be careful with this one. It's telling me to take that negative a and square it, which means I'm multiplying it by itself. Signs are critical in a situation like this. There are 3 negative factors, so I'll have a negative a squared. This last one has parentheses, which says I'm multiplying 4 times itself. I'm sorry, not 4, y times itself 4 times. And I'm also multiplying by a negative 1. So that tells me that my product is going to be a negative y to the 4th. The next thing I wanted to look at briefly are those properties of multiplication. We've already discussed properties of addition, and some of these are the same concept. There are a few additions. Once again, with commutative property, the order in which we multiply numbers does not change the product. That's the same as an addition. The associative property says the way you group 3 numbers when multiplying does not change the product. If you had 17 times 25 times 4, that would be the same as if I took and kept the numbers in the same relative position and just changed the parentheses or the grouping. The second one is much easier to simplify than the first because I can do some mental math. 25 times 4 is 100, and times 17 is so much easier than trying to multiply 17 times 25. We then go into our identity property, which says if you multiply any number by 1, it keeps its identity. The property of 0 says the product of a number and 0 is 0. So if in any of the factors of a problem you have 0, the entire product will be 0. And lastly, the property of opposites. The product of a number and negative 1 is the opposite of the number. Before we move on to something new, I want to talk briefly about evaluating expressions. When I evaluate expressions, I'm going to look at them by replacing the variable with a given value. We did this in expressions before, but now we're going to really be focusing in on products and negative factors. This first one, I'm going to substitute in, and again, negative 5 is my replacement value. So I'll have negative 4 times negative 1, and now this says negative x, which means the opposite of x. So if x is negative 5, the opposite of that would be a positive 5. I now have an even number of negative factors, so my answer is 20. I go on to my second one. I'm going to use -5 as my replacement value for all of these. I start with a -9 7/10. I replace now x with -5, and I have a -2. Right away, you should be able to tell me that your product is going to be negative. Now, I'm going to use the associative property here, and I'm going to group these two terms together. Why? Because this will give me a positive 10. And it's much easier to multiply -9 7/10 by 10 than it is if I went from left to right. This will give me a -97. One last one. Again, I'm looking at replacing x with -5. I have -3, and -5 squared simply says let's take -5 and multiply it by itself. I now notice that I have 3 negative factors, so a negative product. Negative is, 3 is an odd number. I can now multiply. I might do associative property once again and do 5 times 5 is 25 times 3 is 75. Or you could use your left to right rule. So again, we're applying what we've learned about the properties to now use that as we're simplifying algebraic expressions as well. Since we talked a little bit about matrix in the last section, I'm going to do one last thing with matrices, and the rest of matrices, which there is more to do with them, will come in Algebra 2. I'm going to take a single term here, and I'm going to multiply it by, into this matrix, which simply just tells me I'm going to multiply every term by -3. Helps us review our rules. -3 times a -1 is 3. Negative times negative gives me a positive. A negative times a positive is a negative. And any number times 0 is 0. And there is my 2 by 3 matrix that I have multiplied. It's called scalar multiplication. The second one's slightly different. It does have a variable, and we're going to multiply -5x times 2x and get a -10x squared. I've got a negative times a negative, which is now a positive 30xy. On to my second row. Negative times positive gives me a -20xb. And lastly, I'm going to have a positive 40ax, or xa. And that's in a matrix form, so I put it in its proper notation. Here is your assignment for tonight. Going to do some practice at the end of the chapter since we have a quiz next class. Since we have just an extra minute or two, let's just briefly refresh our memory on the distributive property. This will be our lesson if there's time after the quiz. Distributive property just simply says the product of A and B plus C can be distributed or shared. You're going to multiply A times B and A times C. Occasionally you'll see that term to multiply on the right instead of the left. It means the same thing. And I could also do this over subtraction. This is the only time I'm dealing with this that it'll work if there's a sum or a difference within the parentheses. And then I'm just going to get these two products. We'll do a few practice problems if we have time in class.